Welcome everybody to the next version of Kili's webinar series. This month, we're actually taking a look specifically at the Universal ID. We're gonna let everybody here introduce themselves. I'll start with myself. I'm Neil Sweeney. I'm the founder and the CEO of Kili. Kili's place in the ecosystem is we try to be the steward of consumers and allowing consumers to put data back in their hands. I'll pass that over to David, and David, just pass that to somebody else after you finished introducing yourself.
Sure, you bet. Thank you, Neil. I'm David Danziger. I am from the Trade Desk. We're a media buying platform, or DSP, and I am in our data partnerships team, run a number of our strategic data partnerships. So I will pass it to Chris Vio.
Hey there. Looks like I'm still Neil, so we'll figure that after. But Chris Vio, CRO at Tapad. We're now part of Experian as of November of last year. Oversee revenue, and as a business, we focus on identity graphs, really a global solution to support any number of identifiers in a cross-device profile. And Paul.
Thanks. Hey, I'm Paul Bannister, head of strategy for Cafe Media. We are a publisher representative. We run the ads for about 3,000 independent publishers across the web, and function like a publisher in many regards, but we don't create the content.
Pierre.
And sorry.
Thanks. Yes, Pierre. DNA Lotami is our company. We are a data solutions company, global, providing both data management and a data marketplace solutions for our clients. And I work in global partnerships coming out of product, primarily with the goal of evangelizing the most recent innovation, the Panorama ID.
And last but not least, our European friend.
I guess it's me now that I'm finally in. So I'm Matthew Roche. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of ID5. And ID5 is an identity provider specializing in building a replacement infrastructure for the soon-to-be-gone third-party cookies and maids that have been powering the ecosystem over the past decade.
Great. Important note, this webinar is GDPR compliant, Matthew, so no worries on that front either. Okay, I thought I'd frame this up, because as I mentioned to everybody here, the Universal ID is a topic that is getting covered in a variety of trades and various different publications. Clearly, everybody on this webinar has a stake in the ground. So I think to level set here, maybe starting with you, Matthew, is to give everybody just a couple minutes to kind of talk about how their company is positioning themselves sort of specifically in this ID ecosystem. So we'll start with you, Matthew, and we'll rotate from there.
Yeah, sure. So there's Universal ID is a bit of a catch-all, right? A lot of people have different definitions for it. The way we look at it, the problem that we have on the internet is that we've been using cookies and maids to identify device in a stable way, right? Make sure that it's always the same device that is logging to a website or using an app, right? And this device ID, what underpins everything else that makes digital advertising interesting, right? What underpins cross-device and people-based identification, and Chris could speak to that much better than I do. It's what underpins data collection and user segmentation and profiling, and I'll let Pierre dwell on this. It's what underpins the ability for a buyer like the Trade Desk to frequency cap and to target messages and to attribute performance. And it's what powers the business model of all the publishers that Paul represents with Cafe Media. So it's really the foundation, right? It's this little device ID, this little kind of consistent, stable code or string of character that enables us to do everything else that powers the open web, basically, right? And that's what's going away. And so that's what we need to replace as an industry. And ID5's promise in that context is to replace these kind of third-party identifier that we've been using by a first-party version of it, if you wish, that is a lot more privacy compliant, a lot easier to implement compliance with. There's a lot more protective of publisher data, and that works at scale across all the browsers and all the devices that people use to access content on the internet, so that we can continue to do cross-device and people-based marketing, to do user profiling, to do targeting and attribution, and to power the advertising business models of thousands and millions of publishers out there.
Great. And so, Chris, I know that Switchboard is a new product for you guys. Do you want to give a brief overview of how you guys are tackling this ID solution?
Yeah, certainly. I think if you take a step back, the premise of TapAd from day one has been really the ability to connect multiple identifiers, whether it's from a phone, a computer, a tablet, and now obviously the evolution and with that the fragmentation of TV into a structure, whether it's anonymous or authenticated, that allows you to understand a household or a consumer. Obviously, as Matthew mentioned, one of the kind of key underpinnings or the currency that our industry's historically transacted on has been third-party cookies and mobile ad IDs. With everyone on today's webinar and many others that are evolving in the market, there's a number of new identifiers, both in logic and in form, that are coming to fruition. And so with TapAd in our graph, we look at as a natural extension is our Switchboard module, which is a support mechanism to create an identity profile or an identity graph and relationship between the new wave of identifiers that are coming to market.
Got it. And so Lotame is introduced the Panorama ID. Maybe how it's a little different and how Lotame is thinking about this from your vantage point, Pierre.
Great, yeah, thanks. So our view is that, similar to what Matthew was saying about the thousands of publishers and their business use cases, we think we kind of position ourselves in a against the walled gardens in a way, such that we believe in the open web, we believe in the public square and the value of the public square. Right now, the trend, and I think we can all agree that privacy regulation is a very important thing, and that our users, people who use the internet, have fed back to us and have given us feedback that they really need us to respect their privacy and to come up with a means by which to do that. And Lotame's position is the best way to do that and to protect the open web and to protect the public square from frankly destructive algorithms and the various ways in which we are being manipulated in ways we don't understand, is to provide a means by which to communicate ID across device, domain, and platform, such that a single user can opt out of tracking with one button across all of those domain, device, and platform, and to collect all of the things we know about them, etc., to give the user the ability to understand what we're doing with their data and thus drive a more robust, more competitive, and generally healthier public square.
Great. And so one of the solutions that's that the industry seems to be rallying around is what the Trade Desk has been doing. David, maybe from your point of view, just explaining how the Trade Desk is participating, and then we can finish up with Paul's take from his point of view.
Sure. Thanks very much. And I'll start by just saying yes and to what Pierre, Matthew, and Chris have already highlighted with respect to sort of the rationale behind the benefits of some form of an identifier and what it brings, and most importantly, what it does for the open internet. And as I think Pierre said it eloquently with respect to the public square and kind of the marketplace of ideas and the ability for that sort of continued dialogue and support for both content, ideas, and for advertisers to be able to get their message out, for publishers to monetize. All of that is dependent on some form of user recognition. And so to that end, I think all of us on this call are sort of have vested interest and shared thoughts around what the benefits of some form of an ID could be, but not only for the participants in the ecosystem, but for consumers as well and users. So with unified ID, that the Trade Desk is at least championing, but doing it with a wide range of industry participants and ideally interoperable with any of the other IDs that are working out there. Really, we wanted 4 key components: open source and interoperable, independent governance, make it secure and privacy friendly, so it's based on kind of a hashed email concept, and then ultimately, and perhaps most importantly, some form of consumer transparency and control. So building on principles that came from IAB and industry, and ideally working with others in the ecosystem to make it a coherent thing where people don't have to choose this ID, that ID, other IDs, but can work in pretty seamless fashion with any of the IDs out there.
And so, Paul, I mean, you have a unique take here because you've got your hands in a lot of different things, and I think you're probably one of the more qualified people to talk about what's been happening in the Google space as well. So, from your vantage point, where does Cafe Media sit, and maybe talk about how that segues into sort of what we've been seeing from Google and what you've been working on as well with the IAB.
Yeah, sure. I think, I agree with what everyone said, and I agree a lot about the interoperable point. I think there's a few key points. One is as a publisher, we're fairly agnostic. Our, goal is to make it so advertisers can transact easily with us and our publishers, and the mechanism through which that happens. For one, we don't have a strong opinion, but for two, we know there are multiple answers. It's not like there's a one size fits all approach here. That there's many different angles, whether it's universal ID solutions, cohort based solutions, contextual. There's a bunch of different angles and avenues to be taken. So we're evaluating and working on all of those paths because we think that's important. And I think, again, even the word, Matthew said this at the beginning, universal ID means a lot of things to a lot of people. And I think people even talk about identity when they don't even mean identity, when they're talking about things like cohorts, which are to some level, hopefully the de-identification of people, but still able to serve that, kind of end user or that end advertiser case of how do they reach the customers they want to talk to and actually, drive volume for their business. So I think that, keeping in mind the business needs is really important while keeping that lens of user privacy.
Great. So there's a couple of things that I definitely want to get on the agenda here because as much as it's about talking about kind of where we think the industry is going, there'll be a number of people on this webinar who are confused as to what does one solution mean versus the other. Is one interoperable with the other? And I think maybe if I'm framing this up, and I want to take the vantage point of a few different personas here. If I'm an advertiser, we've heard this in the market before from advertisers where they say, "Oh, we as an advertiser need to embrace an identity solution, a next generation identity solution." Maybe I'll start with you, Matthew, on that. Can you talk to that as to whether or not that's a real fear, and maybe put those individual advertisers kind of minds at ease with kind of how you would be thinking about how they should be approaching it?
Yeah, I mean, we're thinking about it as purely an identity topic, and I think a lot of people in the space are thinking about it as an enabler of their core business, which very often will be data or media. So I think it creates a bit of a different perspective. From our standpoint, it's an infrastructure, right? You work with the trade desk. The trade desk today is using cookies and is using Made and is using UID2s, and it's their infrastructure. Do you care? Do you buy the trade desk for that? No, you buy the trade desk because it's the best algorithm to buy your campaigns and to deliver against your targets, right? So it's the enabler of what you're buying as a brand, which is the ability to buy your campaign and deliver them, right? As a publisher, you're using SSPs to monetize. Do you care that they are hosted on Azure or AWS? No, you don't. And you shouldn't care what I think, right? Our position is it's the infrastructure, it's the pipes. It's got to be built into the ad tech layer so that the ad tech layer can work and can do optimization and targeting and attribution and measurement and all those things. Eventually, I don't think it will be a choice for the brand or the publisher. In the short term, we need everybody to lean in because there are different solutions and we can't work with 20 different IDs. We need to kind of align around a handful of them. And so which will be the handful, the market will decide. I think for a brand, what's important is what do you want to do? You want to use data, you want to use technology to be able to address your audiences, right? And the enabler of that will be the identification infrastructure that your data partner and your technology partner use, right? And so I get at it, and I'm sure, Paul, you'll agree to this. I get it's a bit of an original position, given the fact that we're completely focused on providing identity, and we don't have any other kind of business, right? And so that puts us in this really infrastructure layer that's probably a bit different than what most people are doing. But that's my strong conviction. It's an enabler of technology that are what brands and publishers are using to deliver against their targets.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think a lot of this really is on the DSPs. At the end of the day, the horrible picture I painted sometimes is like, one day about a year from now, thousands of media buyers are going to, sit down at their desk and log into their DSP and see that their open web campaigns aren't scaling at all and aren't working. And if that happens, they're going to say, oh, forget this. They don't care about IDs and encryption and other crazy stuff. Like, they just want to make their campaigns work, and they're going to go, well, I'm just going to move all my money to Facebook, and that makes my life easier. And so I think a lot is on the DSPs to make it so that those buying platforms, those media buyers, come sit down at their desk and they're like, oh, like, the third-party data menu now has gone, but it's been replaced with this other thing that allows me to pick the same sort of cohorts or whatever, and for interest groups or whatever the words are, it doesn't matter. But like, replace those use cases in clean and easy ways, and then ID solutions and other platforms like that are that infrastructure layer that sits between. But we want to make it as transparent as possible to the buyers.
So I think Matthew and Paul, I agree entirely with what you said, but that's a little, ways down the process. I think the other piece that's really important here is from the marketer's point of view. It's already very difficult in the digital world to identify your customer across multiple devices. When does the persona say I'm Chris Vio and I am your customer Amex, versus when am I in this anonymous state and you have to address me with data and sometimes treat me like a prospect. And so I think the other key piece of identity, and you look at that with the investment for marketers today, right? Their investment into data science as kind of a core IP coupled with infrastructure is really using the new waves of identifiers that will help them establish identity to then get to the point where you're talking about, Paul and Matthew, of infrastructure to drive media, to drive execution, to drive engagement. And I think that's the part where marketers also really need to lean in, because the keyhole that they look through is already pretty narrow. It's going to get potentially more narrow and wider at the same time with the amount of fragmentation, if there are 5, 6, 7 different identifiers now to replace the third-party cookie.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to kind of put back to the group is sort of that notion, Chris, specifically around fragmentation. A skeptic can kind of look at the market and say, the open web needs more collaboration than probably ever before. But yet here we are as an industry with a variety of kind of fragmented potential solutions here. Does that not kind of play into the hands of the walled gardens? And how do we find the balance between competition and collaboration to get to the end goal? So maybe, Pierre, I'll kind of start you off on that.
I have the answer. No, I don't have the answer, but here's what I hear when I talk to publishers and marketers. I hear privacy. First of all, I think we should all just acknowledge that, like, when we give people the choice to opt in or opt out, a fraction of a percent opt out. So while they say and tell their legislatures that they would like to do this, they don't actively take the action. And it's not because they don't understand how to. It's very clear how to opt out, and they don't. And we know that because we're integrated with all of the CMPs across Europe and the United States. So I think set that in your mind while you think about the following use cases. I think what marketers want is to be able to, like we were saying, identify their customers and really talk to them in a personalized way and add them and give them value. And what publishers want to do is do the same thing. But publishers have this problem, which is if it's an ID that is recognizable across domain device, there's a data leakage issue, such that an intent signal that was achieved by publishers' inventory being associated with this user that can now be kind of hacked and used later, and there's data leakage and there's and I think publishers in the last 10 years have thought, what's really the big thing that's eaten my business is that someone has been able to take the intent value that I garnered with my content and repurpose it, resold it, and didn't give me the value back. I think that's the big issue. I think privacy is important, but the data leakage issue for publishers is the big one. And then for marketers, the big one for them is like, hey, I go to Facebook and I get action. Like, I put money in and it gives me money like 2 times, 3x money back. And I know it does because I can see it. And my main view is that we need to look at those 2 main problems, and we need to figure out a way to solve both of those problems in a way that doesn't threaten publishers from a data leakage perspective, but does give marketers the same kind of the facility and the open web that they have within the walled gardens. That's my pitch.
I think that's well stated, Pierre, as far as the challenges. And so And to your question, Neil, about more collaboration versus less, it does point to certain kinds of solutions. The good news is I do think all the things being talked about as potential improvements, whether it's a cohort-based system or some concept of a universal ID, address some of those things in better ways potentially than third-party cookies ever did, in the sense of, third-party cookies, as Pierre noted, had the issues. Pierre Martin noted had the issues related to data leakage, not necessarily being able to measure, tying back to the offline world in interesting ways. Like all of those things, I think created some challenges along the way. And the fact that third-party cookies involved syncing with 200, 300 different entities along the way to make it efficient and work. And that efficient probably wasn't the right word to use for that. So the idea of that we're even having this discussion around any form of universal IDs, even if it's not truly universal, if each of us end up with 5 or 10 that we're working with that are in some way rooted in a secured anchor against, call it an offline identity, whether it's a hashed email or something else, that can in turn measure real world activity as well as you cross through from planning, execution, analytics, measurement, all the different components, you start to address the security associated with data leakage for publishers, as well as the offline measurement and capabilities in the real world that I think probably extend and favor the open web's ability to compete with walled gardens, who will be measuring themselves and anchored strictly within their walls in ways that I think are much more bounded than what we can offer in the open web.
Yeah, just one comment on the number of IDs, right? Like I hear people say, oh, now there's like 10, 15, 20, it's getting so complicated. We come from a world where there are hundreds of IDs, right? Each individual platform has its own ID today. This is complicated, right? It's an exponential problem. Trying to match 1,000 platform with another 1,000 platform, that's impossible to do, right? And so let's not pretend that the third-party cookie world is great. It doesn't work. It's not efficient because of matching. It's terrible for publishers. All of the doors and all of the windows are open. Anybody can get in and access data, right? It's terrible. So we're not going to go from super complicated, super messy to perfect just like that, right? But it's already a massive step forward in simplifying, securing, improving performance, that we're getting to a world where we have only 5, 10, or 15, or 20, whatever that will be, and it's candidates right now, right? We know that there will be consolidation. We know that it will become simpler than that. So, and I don't even know that one would be better, to be honest. Right? I think that creates another issue, which is dependency on that one. So like, I think if we can get to like a few thousand, right, platform specific IDs down to 5 shared currency that enable everybody globally to trade advertising at scale, we're in a much better place.
You're here.
I agree with that. Yeah.
So one of the other questions that I wanted to kind of get on the table, and I'm trying to knock off things that I hear in the market from various different clients, is the notion of the login or the notion of scale, right? So this idea of, well, everybody has to be logged in. How are you going to get to scale? I don't know who wants to jump on this one. We could probably, everybody's got an opinion on this, but maybe just for the audience, we could address the notion of what do we mean by login, and how are we going to solve this notion of what people believe or perceive scale or lack of perceived scale?
David, this one's probably most close home to you as a starting point.
I'll jump in. I'm happy to. The idea of a login is, it's new and it's not. It depends what you think of as the alternative from the get-go. So for a lot of us that have lived in the open web for a long time, the idea that somebody was to some degree recognizable in the absence of a login has made it very easy to think in terms of scale. But if you're a publisher and dependent on monetization, and your alternatives are, I can do it via ad revenue, I can do it via subscription or a paywall, or somewhere on a sliding scale in between, the more you're dependent on, the less you can depend on ad monetization, the more you better expect users, consumers to be ready to whip out their wallet, which is not an easy thing to convince consumers to do. So anyway, the idea of if I'm a consumer and I want access to particular content, the more we can communicate with consumers that, hey, the value of this content is the exchange of an email that's not going to be used to spam you, but is going to be used as a mechanism to understand for better and more relevant advertising, the better chance we have to get to scale. It's not an easy conversation to have if free has been the benchmark, but free hasn't always been the benchmark. And the alternative for that content is the idea of relevant advertising. And so the idea of a login for currency, will we get to the scale we were used to with cookies? That's going to be tough, but the more people that come on board, the easier it will get, and the more people will become accustomed to it as a baseline.
I think that, David, as each one of us as consumers, never mind ad techers, if you will, like we all log in, right? We all log into different properties and sites. I think that the challenge that you mentioned is there will be some critical mass that is able to be captured on some devices and some environments within those devices. But if you look at the fragmentation over the past 10 years, right, the computer and phone were our primary devices. Now you move to computer, phone, tablet, TV, and whatever else is on the horizon. I mean, we look at our data in the graph, there's 13 different physical devices per household. Each device has 2 or 3 different sub-environments between a browser, an app. You look at the TV, you could have 4 or 5 IDs, depending on what your subscriptions are. That starts to balloon. So the world of thinking of breadth, total number of consumers, there will be a lot of consumers logged in. The total number of depth, though, devices and IDs per consumer that will be logged in will leave a blind spot where third-party cookies or MAIDs have operated. And I think that's why there will be this balance between kind of 2 different schools of thought to create what's most important here, a privacy-safe way to address that breadth and depth issue that makes the internet and the open internet, I think, so unique and combative to what you think about with the walled garden environment.
Yeah, I think we're trying to, the walled gardens have been very successful and they have forced logins. Okay. Does it mean the only way to be successful is to force login? I don't think so. I'm sure, for the Why Travel blog, which is a Cafe Media site, if I'm not mistaken, Paul, it's going to be very difficult for them to justify people to give them an email address, right? And I think we've falsely simplified privacy by saying you have to be logged in. Like if you're logged in, we're really, really sure you agree to us processing your data. It's not exactly the same thing, right? I can give you my email address and not agree for you to use it. And I can say, I agree for you to use data about me, but I don't want to give you my email address. So the notion of login and the notion of consent are very different. What we need is consent. We need people to say, I'm okay with that value exchange. I'm okay with you identifying me so that I can access the content and the services without having to pay for it, right? If we have this, however I express it, by giving you my email address, by giving you my phone number, by clicking on the button that says yes, by whatever, right? Provided we have this, then we're able to power that relationship on a one-to-one basis. And if we have a login, great, because as David was saying, right, it ties to offline buying, it ties to people-based information, to customer databases, super valuable. But we know that it's going to be a very small portion of traffic. And if all we can offer brands is 5% of the population they can reach on the open web, they're going to put even more of their money on Google and Facebook. So we need to have something that scales, and logins are not going to scale. And so we believe that by combining logins or deterministic approaches with probabilistic methods, right? Provided we have user consent, provided the user said, yeah, I'm fine with that deal, right? If we can combine that, then we can scale, and then we can have an infrastructure that supports broader investments from brands into the open web, which is why we're doing that for.
I think for us, we think about a lot of it with respect to engaging the user, and it's about figuring out like what do they want from us as a publisher. To use a travel site as a good example. Like some users might show up because they want to read one article on one place they want to go to, and that's their engagement, and you're not going to push them beyond that. But somebody might come and say like, okay, like I'm taking a 3-month trip to Australia and I want to get this $10 package, and like you're going to buy some kind of ebook or some other product that publisher has. Some other person is going to come in, they're going to say like I'm thinking about it, I want your email newsletter. Some other person's going to say like there is a reason for me to log in because you've got this tool that I want to use. And I think it's about figuring out for each user what's the right way to engage them and what do they want, and not trying to force people into like one way. It's understanding their particular needs and engaging that kind of person in the right way to help explain the value exchange and help build a deeper relationship between the publisher and the user.
So one thing I wanted to stay on, Paul, just maybe with you, because I think you have a unique vantage point as it relates to the publishers. The one cohort that I actually think is maybe exposed here is the long tail. So maybe from an opinion point of view is that, irrespective of whatever identifier, publisher or login, or what happens in this environment with Google and the universal solutions that are in the market to those publishers that represent the long tail?
I mean, I think the real long tail, I'm not sure. Like that's going to be pretty tough. I think, in the real long tail, there is some fair amount of sites that are like super, super niche focused and therefore can do well for that kind of given thing. We tend to work with like what I would say more is like mid-tail, like sites that have gotten a fair amount of scale and volume, but are not like, owned by some major media conglomerate or whatever. So they've got an audience. And I think the one thing we see with a lot of our sites, at least, is that once you get to that level, again, like users are interested in engaging because one, they've got specific content that person cares about. It's something that is engaging with them. And in many cases, for our publishers at least, it's a real person. And it's a person that me as a user can look at and say like, oh, wow, like I really like what, Jen has to say. Like, I like her, her travel advice, or I like, Bill's cooking site or whatever. And like, you can feel that personal connection. So I think that sites that are not, like the really, really big ones, I think actually can build good relationships. One, because they've got really targeted content that speaks to an audience in a deep way. The silly example I use with that is like, we don't have this site, but like, and maybe there isn't, maybe we do have it, but Indian slow cooker vegetarian recipes, like that's super, super targeted. But for the person who wants that content, that's awesome. Like that's what they want. And like, they want to have a relationship with that publisher because that's something that really is meaningful to them. So I think that they can do, the sites can do well because they've got great targeted content, and also because they're real people and people like that personal connection.
Yeah, I think the Trade Desk has a private marketplace on that specific segment, but I'm not entirely sure. We can't have this webinar without talking about the email. I mean, there's a lot of information floating around, specifically around the email. So I'd say let's maybe start with the notion of Google has suggested that they're not going to be supporting the next generation identifier, i.e. the email, on a go-forward basis. Knowing that the email tends to be foundational to a lot of the identity solutions in the marketplace today, how does that throw a wrench in things? And then secondly, what I would say is email set up to suffer the same fate of privacy just because of its sort of its private nature? Maybe David, we'll start with you, and we can kind of work through the group for an opinion on that.
Yeah, good question. I think Google's announcement is and their continued sort of evolution on what they've said they will and won't look at has been interesting to follow. And one of the things that is always challenging is we on discussions like this and in articles and how it's discussed, we have a tendency to think and speak of Google as a monolith, as a singular entity, if you will, where in reality there's a Chrome team, there's an Android team, there's a team that came from DoubleClick, from Invite, from that's evolved over time, each with its own interests as relates to its product set. And so it may be that some of what's discussed along the way may or may not come to pass along the way, but what we do know is what we know, what's been published. And so far, the indication is that there's not going to be recognition of an identifier, which does point to that maybe there are going to be some other cohort-based systems that they've talked about, Privacy Sandbox, that may be relevant. But back to your sort of your broader point with emails, are they going to suffer the same fate from a privacy standpoint? Very hard to say. Ultimately, we're envisioning scenarios with Unified ID 2, and this will ultimately be, governed by the body that administers code of conduct and the technical standards along the way. But we're envisioning that it's likely to not just remain with emails, but also potentially include things like hash phone numbers, which will make it far more relevant and applicable as you move into a lot of the regions in APAC. So I don't know what the evolution with email will be and the privacy view for it, but I think there are the continued push for a mechanism of identification for users, for relevant advertising. It's not going to change. The mechanisms may change, but the desire and the rationale for a value for value exchange that's underpinned by identity will mean that there's going to be something there in most mechanisms along the way.
Pierre, any comments from the Lotami side?
Well, I just, Matthew, I haven't actually heard that argument before said as well as you just made it earlier around the concept of consent versus email. And I think we are at the mercy of a group of regulators and lawyers who have guided us. At least in my company, our legal counsel guides us. I don't never have a direct argument with them about what I think should be or shouldn't. And generally the counsel we get is that the email is this thing that can contain consent more firmly, more legitimately than any other signal. But what you just propose, or like what you're advocating for, is this concept of consent doesn't necessarily need to have an email. I'm really interested in that idea. I think it makes a lot of sense philosophically that we're not talking about emails, we're talking about consent. And if we can build a system of trust with users, with internet users, and say, this is the way in which we capture your consent, this is the way in which so accountability, transparency, control, that's what GDPR says we need. It doesn't say you need an email, right? It says accountability, transparency, and control. And if we can come up with a means by which to provide that, then it doesn't need to be an email. Now, do I know what the alternative is, Neil? Do I have the answer? I don't, but I really do think it's important to lean into what Matthew's point is around that the email currently contains, it's like the lightning rod for all of our thoughts because it exists. But there's a thing that exists or could exist that would be better than it, in my view.
Matthew, do you have a counter argument, or do you want to add to that?
No, I totally agree that there are different, Google is not a monolith, and I think Chrome and Google Ads, I don't think those guys are going to go on vacation together anytime soon. I think there's been a lot of conflicts internally, and what the announcement says is, like, Google Ads will not use external IDs. It doesn't mean that external IDs will not exist and will not power the open web and will not power ad tech in the future, right? It means like the Google side of the ad tech world would not use them because my guess is they lost a bet internally and and Chrome won it, or yeah, some form of bet. But anyway, we're talking about powering the business model of thousands and thousands of websites and access to content and services that people rely on, right? That websites rely on, that users expect to have access to, and this advertising-based business model is powered by addressability, right? And it's not powered by email addresses. It's powered by signals that allow us to address users consistently across sites and across app over time, right? And so if there's an email that can do that, great. If there is something else that can do that, good as well. Again, nothing in Google's announcement says that's not going to work. And frankly, technically, it's very, very difficult to prevent that from working, right? Like, short of rewriting the internet protocol and And there's like, yeah, there's not a lot of things you can do. They've chosen a different path. They decide that privacy is a privacy sandbox, maybe because it says privacy is better from a privacy standpoint. I don't know. I think it can be discussed. If you call it the non-privacy sandbox, does it make it worse? I don't know. I mean, we're basically, again, the pillars of transparency, and I'm wearing my European hat here, but like the pillars of transparency are control and transparency, right? That's what privacy is. Control of the user. User has to say yes. I have to say I agree. I'm happy with you, using data about me. And transparency. I know what you're going to do with my data, right? That's what privacy is according to the regulations of the past 10 years across the board. CCPA, that same principles everywhere, right? What the privacy sandbox is a way to make it non-transparent by the magics of algorithm, and to remove a control for users, because guess what? It's not personal data anymore. It's a group. So like, you're not in control of it anymore. So side comments, right? But again, privacy is important. Privacy is the foundation of what we're doing, and we need a means to guarantee that privacy, but also to guarantee that advertising works on the open web, because that's what powers the system. And I think email is a means to that end.
So we talk a lot about control and transparency as it relates to the ecosystem, but we're not really talking about it as it relates sort of specifically to the consumer. I think we would probably all agree that when we look at the privacy legislation of the past, where it is today and where it's going, increasingly including the consumer seems to be the trend. When we talk about control and transparency, how do we think about the consumer being increasingly involved in this discussion? Maybe Paul, do you have an opinion on that, or Chris?
I do think it needs to be made easy, to use like the extreme case of where it's not easy, like GDPR as implemented today, where if as a user I want to exercise my purpose 4, 9, and 11 rights under GDPR, I've got to do an enormous amount of nonsensical work to control that consent across every single site and app that I go to, and that clearly is not the right answer. So I think we have to figure out ways to make it so users can come up with their own rules around what they care about and what they don't care about, and let those things work. I think in the US, well, and maybe this goes beyond the US, but there's tools like GPC, Global Privacy Control, that are trying to come up with standardized ways for users to expose that information about, again, what they care about and what they consent to, and they can override it where they need to. But for me as a user, like I've got a set of my own rules in my head about what I think is appropriate that are going to be different from everyone else on this call. And I should be able to kind of set it once and let that be my rules and put that out into the world. But we have to make it's got to be easy. If it's not easy, people either won't, then it's all about the defaults. And then it's either basically everyone's out or everyone's in. And neither one of those is a good solution either.
Paul, I think you nailed it there. The average person, we've got 150, 60 people on today's call, most of which, have a hard time articulating and understanding, when entrenched in this industry, all the changes in privacy and what it means for us, not as people that make money from this industry, but as actual consumers. And so until that becomes seamless and easy, that my wife upstairs or my neighbors can actually understand this exchange for privacy, for kind of content and therefore the monetization of the internet, I think we have this kind of top-down regulation that's making decisions for us. And it will continue to force us to move the bar. And I think, all of our companies have continued to optimize for privacy first, and then our core business is kind of second. But until we get to a point where it's universally understood and quote unquote adopted, we will be in this kind of place where it's always a moving target.
Did you have a thought on that before we jump to another question? You're good?
Me?
Yes.
Oh, I could. Yeah. I agree with what Chris said actually as well, that it feels like, we're all trying our best to balance it for what we need to do within our companies, within our industry, but obviously taking into account more and more what consumers are thinking about, what regulators are thinking about. And I like the way Paul characterizes as well in terms of, are there better ways that we can make it simple, probably centralized for consumers, where they're not intimidated by it, where it's something more than just something popping up saying, hey, cookies? Do you accept something more that gives control? I like the metaphor that I feel like it's so frequently used is some concept of a dimmer switch of where my data is used, why it's being used, how it's being used, and at the same time, within our industry, we're used to seeing the idea of 500 thousands of different data components that go along with possibilities for targeting, and that scares the hell out of a consumer, probably rightly so if they're not used to seeing it. But when we think about how it could get used for advertising and letting the consumer have some meaningful control that's not, to Paul's point, yes, no, on, off, we need better ways to keep doing that. And it feels like we're moving that direction.
So
Yeah, just a comment on this, because there's a question that from someone who didn't give his full name, but will Universal ID platform come together to have universal consent? I think that's a good question, and I think that ties to what we're saying, right? We need this to be simple, we need this to be unified, and the IAB Tech Lab is doing a really good job here. And I think similar to the transparency portal is what you've called it at Trade Desk when you talked about it in the first time, I think. Right, having some form of like advertising authorization scheme, right, whereby you in one place you can go and you can say I'm happy with this, I'm not happy with that, right? I think that's much needed, because I fully agree with what you guys have said. It needs to be simpler for users, so that it becomes simpler for the rest of the ecosystem. And if it's not simpler for user won't engage, and then we'll be back to square one. So it's really important to make it simple, and that a unified consent mechanism, right? Learning from what has been done with the TCF in Europe, for instance, to make that information accessible to everybody, but having a better front end is much needed.
I think, Matthew, too, it's also important, not just the ability for consent, but what happens when the consumer wants to opt out as well, right? In the world of equal fragmentation of, if there's 4 IDs on this phone call today and data's, derived from ID5 and utilized for targeting on a UID and offline measurement through Load.me, how can that same consumer understand who do I opt out of at that point? Where did I give consent? What am I exiting, quote unquote, not through that process? So I think a lot of it is the foundation of interoperability between our companies. We're solving the same problem different ways, right? And creating a mechanism for that agnostic approach to data collection in a privacy-safe way.
I think, but with that, just to stay on that consent string, I think that there's some flaws sort of specifically even around consent. Consent right now is sort of evergreen. We're seeing people, having signed in or done a form fill, and consent lives forever, even though it's been taken out of that existence. So, to me, the notion of consent will be the next thing that we'll have to look at. We believe that consent is like milk. It expires over time. So this philosophy of actually being able to reestablish consent, we believe the notion of kind of time-stamped consent is sort of where the future of the industry is going. And if you think about the number of companies that are in the space, a number of them are publicly traded. Data and consent and opt-out are now equal to liability, which means if you do not have a dynamic way of inserting those into your solution, you're literally carrying liability. So I thought, the consent piece also, just kind of quickly, Chris, the point about, being able to opt out is really not in favor of the consumer. I think in the US, you have a federal do not call list, but you do not have a federal do not track list. Trying to opt out of anything as a consumer is virtually impossible. You technically, by the rule, can opt out of site A or platform B, but trying to do that, en masse puts an incredible onus on the consumer. So which, kind of comes back to the conversation around this notion of control and transparency. It's one thing for us as an industry to say, yes, it's all about, consent and control and transparency, but are we really living up to what we're saying when we're not really giving the consumers those tools? I don't know what you guys think of that.
I think I'll jump in a little bit. I think it's been mixed so far. It's interesting, incidentally, Neil, that you referenced the federal do not call list, because it's a sort of a poignant example of what's old is new again. And the whole reason the do not call list was created at a federal level was that, it started with 2 states doing a do not call list. It ballooned to 17, 18, 19. And then, suddenly the recognition that, hey, this is unwieldy to manage for a marketer or for consumers to do this for national. So the concept of some kind of either central consumer control mechanism where consumers know this is where to go, or at least ones that talk to each other in a way that, I think the ad choices concept did fairly well for making it somewhat easy for consumers to opt out, but it's not perfect. And so, back to your question, have we done a good job with it? There's definitely a lot of room to do it much better for consumers, and to make it much more of a choice when they opt in and how and when they opt out along the way too, or do they get automatically aged out, which I thought was a very interesting point too, and probably a good way to think about it too, that consent shouldn't necessarily automatically imply forever consent too.
Ironically, I know Paul's got a comment, is that what we see in the market is that consent actually outlives the data itself. The email bounces, but the consent lives on, right? So that in itself should tell you that there's some gaps that collectively we need to align on. Paul?
I think the other thing, which was mentioned earlier in the call, is accountability, which I think is the other critical thing here. And I think that's where what Pram is doing and Rearc is really good, to start setting up those guidelines and really making sure we actually live by them. And, we're seeing this in other parts of the industry right now, but to go totally to the side with sellers.json and buyers.json, which solve different issues, we're seeing people get penalized for not following those rules. And that's good. And the exact same thing needs to be happening here, where if there are bad actors, they need to be, truly dealt with and made accountable. And because we can't have that in the ecosystem, it's just not going to work.
Right on, Paul. And I by the way, if we solve this, we solve a lot. Honestly, we solve this piece, the thing we're all just nailing around. And I know I kind of diminished it by saying only a fraction of people opt out. But really, to totally contradict myself, we do solve the consent piece, the idea that I can opt out with a single button, understand my relationship with the internet is going to be the dimmer switch, but it's the internet. It's not this individual publisher. And like you said, Paul, bad actors are out. You're not on the internet team if you mess up. And then, dang it, I think we're close. I do think the privacy, the IB Tech Lab privacy working, they're doing some interesting stuff. They're essentially taking the string and making it a global concept. The TCF 2.0, understandably, it's not awesome, and I know some folks in privacy land don't love it. But shoot, it's close. It's a start, and it's standardized, and it does have that whole notion of bad and good actors and partners in good standing kind of thing. So yeah, I think we're really circling around the main nugget of the challenge we have. And Keeley is really at the center of it. You're in the center of my screen right now, Neil, but you're also at the center of this concept, right? Of solving that issue for the internet, at least for some portion of it.
Yeah, hopefully I'm at the center of your heart there too, Pierre. But I think our whole philosophy is that we're very different. We try to focus on the consumer. So what we believe is that if you start at the consumer, good things happen. Downstream things like fraud, transparency, consent, privacy tend to go away if you maintain a relationship one-to-one with the consumer. The challenge in the market is that as a consumer, what's your destination? So that there's plenty of B2B solutions, not many B2C solutions. What's the B2C solution for every person who's got a digital persona that is online today? I'm definitely conscious of us starting to run out of time, so I want to knock off a few quick questions here. Maybe firstly, an opinion on the future of third-party data in the marketplace, as asked in the forum. Is third-party data dead? Is it gone? And are we entirely dependent upon this first-party and second-party world? Chris or Matt, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I do. I think I spent most of 2020 explaining that third-party cookies and third-party data are two different things. We're losing the ability to identify users with third-party cookies. We're not losing the ability to qualify them and to understand who they are. And it's still equally important as it was 2 years ago for prospecting, because if you only have data about people you know, how do you get new clients, right? So third-party data remains super important. It will not be tied to third-party cookie-based ID. It will be tied to ID5 IDs or UID2s or other forms of identification. It will be stronger because it will be more privacy safe. It will be more protective of the owner of that data. But it's still there, and it still has a place and a very important role to play in the industry going forward.
Yeah, Matthew, don't stop at 2020. Keep evangelizing that narrative of third-party cookies and third-party data for remainder of this year as well, because I think you're spot on. And even Matthew, going back to not just the prospect, but third-party data is important to understand more about your customers as well. You only look like one flavor of who you are to a brand by the nature of how you work with them. If you really want to grow that relationship, you need to add in additional signal to be able to understand. So I don't see third-party data going anywhere. I just see it being kind of created and then established in means that are different than what we've expected to date, and probably a little bit more difficult to do so than just dropping a pixel and having a retargeting segment that can be used everywhere.
One other question that we had specifically from the data provider perspective is similar to what we talked about earlier in the conversation about publishers. The data provider, the default reaction tends to be, do I have to underpin my data with every single one of these identifiers so that I can take advantage of the transaction that the person on the other side is using?
Just use the 85 ID.
Yeah. So, any thoughts on that, Chris? Because I know you tend to. I think the switchboard tends to sort of be supportive of all of those, but I know that that's come up amongst a number of data providers that they've got to underpin with Panorama, ID5, switchboard, etc.
I mean, listen, when we thought about, again, this next evolution of TapAd, our core pillars stay the same, right? How can we be agnostic? How can we be interoperable? And how can we create a framework for our customers to be able to have a structured identity approach? The big change is the IDs that make up the graph. They're not going to be third-party cookies and maids, right? There's going to be a combination of the folks on the phone today and the mid-tail and the long tail of other, 26 some odd IDs out there. As a marketer and as a brand, how do you know where to start and where to finish, right? And like a good, dirty martini, it's not just a shot of vodka. There's a combination that allows you to get there. And so we look at the world for our customers as there's going to be different ingredients domestically and globally that make up your identity. And that's the role that we're looking to play. And this actually goes to a question someone else asked us. Like at TapAd, we don't create the ID. We're relying on Matthew and Pierre and David and everyone else to create a privacy safe identifier. We're trying to create a relationship between those IDs so that as a consumer, you actually benefit from either how your data is used all the way through the end of it. How do you opt out and not just opt out of Matthew, but opt out of everybody? No, not Matthew, but ID5, obviously.
I like how we got the lunchtime martini in there. That's fitting for us.
Well, you had the pocket square on, so we're already halfway there.
Yeah, the martini. We've gone full Mad Men. Okay.
It's 5 p.m. here, guys. I'm gonna go make myself one.
Everybody's looking for the bar. Last question, just before we jump, maybe. We talk a lot about the next generation identifiers. We've spent a lot of time talking about the cookie and the email. We haven't spent any time talking about the mobile identifier. I think clearly there's lots of conversation around what's going on in Apple, but is the pattern or is the path already set that post cookie that Google looks to kind of deprecate the Android identifier for the exact same reasons? And if so, does that mean we're all scrambling for mobile identifiers across ecosystem? And what's that going to do for our solutions in the industry?
Rinse and repeat.
I have some
Same thing.
thoughts there. I mean, the idea of, so just for, everyone knows there's a difference between a first party domain cookie and a third party cookie. I think similarly, there's the difference between the device level identifier and the app level identifier. And I think we're just going to move to that. And I think Apple will say you can't do it, but ultimately back down because it really does harm their app developers to not permit them to monetize in anything but the App Store. So I think they'll they'll back down. I think Google will get rid of the device identifier, but support a app level identifier. And then we'll have a kind of first party app ID space that we'll be using. That's my forecast.
App based meaning that I have Uber and Lyft on my device. Is that what you mean by app based?
Uber has a Pierre identifier, but not a GAID for Pierre.
Got it. Any other comments on that, guys?
No, I think the direction of travel is the same. I mean, Google and Apple are not doing that for privacy reasons. They're doing that to control the ecosystem even more than they currently do, right? And so that's the reason why they remove third-party cookies from browsers. That's the same reason why they're going to remove Maids from mobile OS. So again, rinse and repeat. We're going to have the same challenge of having a stable in-app identifier that works across apps. It just won't be provided by the OS anymore. It will be provided by, UID2 or ID5 or Lodomi or similar things, and it will replace the IDFN, the GAID, as a key that people can append data to address customers and to target campaigns and to measure performance of campaigns. So yeah, it's just a question of months. Give it a few months. We're getting there.
Perfect. We know it's a time because Pierre's wife is doing a drive-by behind him, so needed to call that out. Thanks everybody for joining. We recorded this, so it'll be available. We'll send it to obviously all the participants. Everybody's got great expertise, great opinions. I'd encourage every person who's listening to this to check out the various different solutions. We'll have to come back and revisit this topic in the future because I think it'll be interesting to see where we land, 6 to 12 months from now. So hopefully we'll see each other at the Chandelier Bar at CES or one of these other places and not have to do these, on Zoom every time, but appreciate everybody's participation here. So thanks so much, guys. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Pleasure.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.